When President Trump appealed to Canada for trade relief, the expectation was straightforward. This would be handled quietly, behind closed doors, the way trade pressure usually is. But that's not what happened. Instead of private talks, Ottawa responded publicly. And within hours, that response was everywhere. Not because it was aggressive, not because it was dramatic, but because it didn't sound like a country being asked for help. It sounded like a country that understood time was working in its favor. There was no urgency in the tone, no hint of concession, no sense that Canada felt cornered by the request. And that's what caught people off guard. Because when an appeal is met with composure instead of compromise, it quietly raises a different question. Not whether relief will come, but who actually holds leverage when it's being asked for. And once that question enters the conversation, the trade issue itself becomes secondary. What matters is what this response revealed about the balance between Washington and Ottawa, and whether that balance has already shifted more than most people realize. Now, before we continue to our topic, let me introduce you myself. I'm Evan Cross. On this channel, we track power shifts most people miss. And if you are new to this channel, and I'm sure you are new here because we just started this channel, make sure you subscribe because you will see all the latest and uncovered insights on this channel. Now let's continue with our topic. What made this moment stand out wasn't the appeal itself. Appeals happen when pressure builds and waiting becomes expensive. That part wasn't unusual. What changed the dynamic was what happened immediately after the appeal was made. Expectations formed quickly. This would move fast. Quiet conversations, careful back and forth. That's the usual rhythm when relief is requested. But the rhythm didn't arrive. Once the appeal was made, the clock was supposed to start. That's how these moments usually work. Time tightens. Responses follow. Everyone moves. The assumption was that Ottawa would meet the moment at the pace it demanded, either by signaling compromise or by pushing back. Ottawa didn't do that. There was no rush to match the moment. No attempt to absorb the pressure being sent its way. The response didn't speed things up or slow them dramatically. It simply refused to move at the pace the appeal implied. And as that pace stalled, something shifted. This is where things began to tilt. Nothing was announced, nothing escalated. But one side was waiting and the other side wasn't moving. And when that happens, the pressure doesn't disappear. It turns around. First, businesses paused decisions tied to cross-border trade. Then markets stopped assuming a quick resolution. Then partners who rely on predictability began asking quieter questions, not publicly, but internally. Each pause fed the next. And with every delay, the original assumption weakened. What made this especially revealing was that Canada didn't assert anything new. It didn't escalate. It didn't counter. It didn't explain. The restraint itself became the message. The appeal created urgency. The response declined to carry it forward. And once that happened, the interaction stopped being about trade relief alone. It became about position, about who needed the next move more, about whether waiting was still a risk or whether it had quietly become the advantage, which leads to the question that now sits underneath everything that follows. If an appeal can be met with this kind of composure, without urgency or concession, what does that say about where the pressure actually lives now? And more importantly, what happens next when stillness itself starts shaping the outcome? What followed that initial response wasn't escalation. It was a pause that lasted just long enough to register. No announcement, no clarification, just space. And that space immediately changed how the appeal was read. The hours passed without the usual signals. No follow-up statement, no effort to shape interpretation. The expectation had been movement. Instead, there was stillness. And the stillness didn't sit evenly between both sides. It pressed back toward the one that had asked. The appeal had assumed momentum. It assumed that once the request was made, the process would naturally advance. But instead of advancing, it stalled. And as it stalled, the interaction quietly changed shape. What should have been the next step in a negotiation began to feel like a test of patience. People closest to the situation noticed first. Advisors stopped using timelines when they spoke. Words like soon and expected disappeared. Briefings shifted from planning next steps to waiting for signals that weren't coming. No one said the pause mattered, but everyone behaved as if it did. Then the adjustments began to stack. Officials avoided committing to follow-up dates. Public language softened around expectations. References to urgency were replaced with phrases that left room. Not delay, room. Each small shift made the next one easier, and together they slowed the entire rhythm of the exchange. What stood out was who hesitated first. The side that had asked for relief became careful about pushing, because pushing would expose need, and exposure would shift leverage even further away. So instead of acceleration, there was restraint. Not chosen freely, chosen carefully. That restraint created a symmetry. One side was waiting to see what would come next. The other was deciding whether anything needed to come next at all. That imbalance doesn't resolve quickly. It lingers. It sits under every interaction that follows. And the longer it lingered, the harder it became to return to the original premise. The appeal had introduced urgency. The response refused to carry it forward. Now the pressure wasn't about trade relief anymore, it was about control of the next move, which raises the next issue. If even a short pause can force this much recalculation, what happens when the situation demands clarity instead of patience? When waiting stops being neutral and someone has to decide whether to press, adjust, or hold? Because whichever choice comes next will say far more than the appeal ever did. What changed next wasn't the tone of the conversation. It was who started paying attention. Until this point, the pause had lived mostly inside government channels, advisors, officials, quiet briefings. But then it began showing up elsewhere, in places that don't wait for official confirmation, in markets, in boardrooms, in planning meetings that depend on timelines holding steady. The first sign was small. An order tied to a cross-border supply chain was paused, not canceled, just paused. Then another team reviewed a contract that had assumed continuity, not rewritten, reviewed. Then contingency planning appeared in a meeting where it hadn't been mentioned in months. Each step made sense on its own. Together they signaled something had changed. That uncertainty spread unevenly. Firms with thin margins felt it immediately. Waiting cost them money. Firms with alternatives barely noticed at first. They had room. That contrast mattered because it showed where pressure was landing and where it wasn't. What stood out was that none of this required instruction. No announcement told anyone to slow down. No policy shift forced recalculation. The pause itself did the work. It introduced just enough doubt to make certainty expensive. And once certainty becomes expensive, caution stops looking optional. As that caution took hold, behavior adjusted again. Planning horizons shortened. Exposure was trimmed where possible. Assumptions that had felt safe weeks earlier were quietly set aside. No one framed it as a reaction, but everyone acted like one. Partners who rely on predictable trade rhythms started asking different questions, not about outcomes, but about timing. Not what would happen, but when clarity would return. And when no one could answer that, those questions stopped being asked publicly. Instead, recalculation moved inward. Assumptions shifted quietly. Alternatives were revisited. None of this required confirmation. It required only the absence of movement. What made this moment important is that these reactions weren't driven by what Canada said. They were driven by what didn't follow. The lack of urgency, the absence of reassurance, the refusal to accelerate. Each omission became information. And once omission becomes information, leverage stops being contained between two governments. It starts shaping behavior across everyone watching, which brings the tension forward again. If a single pause can ripple outward like this, altering decisions far beyond the negotiation itself, what happens when the next moment demands action instead of patience? Because once hesitation begins affecting people who weren't part of the original exchange, the cost of waiting stops being abstract. And someone eventually has to decide whether that cost is still worth carrying. The shift became harder to ignore once waiting started to cost something tangible. Up to this point, hesitation had spread quietly. Pauses, reviews, adjustments that could still be framed as caution. But then the delay ran into something it couldn't negotiate with. A deadline that wouldn't move. When that passed, a shipping window closed. After that, a choice that had been available weeks earlier simply disappeared. Not debated, not rejected, just gone. Those moments didn't arrive all at once. They arrived one after another. And with each one, the space to keep waiting shrank. That change altered behavior again. Conversations that had stayed internal grew shorter. Fewer options were mentioned. The same people who had once talked through scenarios now limited themselves to what was immediately possible. Hesitation didn't sound like hesitation anymore. It sounded like silence. What made this moment different from earlier pauses was that the cost of waiting was no longer abstract. It showed up in missed timing, in compressed schedules, in trade-offs that forced people to choose between imperfect outcomes. And once choices become constrained, leverage starts to feel heavier. Some actors tried to push gently against the pressure. They floated small signals, testing whether movement would be met or resisted. Others pulled back even further, choosing containment over exposure. Different reactions, same conclusion. The environment had changed. Waiting was no longer neutral. What stood out was how carefully Canada continued to move. No rush to relieve pressure, no visible effort to accelerate resolution. The posture remained controlled, but it no longer felt effortless. It required attention, precision, awareness that each additional delay was registering elsewhere. By this point, the tone had shifted without anyone naming it. Fewer reassurances were offered. Language tightened. The conversation itself began closing in around fewer possibilities. The original appeal had asked for relief. The response had slowed the clock. The ripple had spread outward. Now the pressure was pressing inward, concentrating around decisions that could no longer be postponed. And that raised a more uncomfortable question. If delay is no longer spreading uncertainty but concentrating it, who feels that weight first? And when someone finally decides they can't wait any longer, what kind of move does that pressure produce? Because once options start closing on their own, the next step stops being theoretical. It becomes unavoidable. The first move didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived because waiting stopped being possible. A decision that had been held back finally had to be addressed, not because clarity had improved, but because delay itself was starting to cause damage. The space to keep absorbing uncertainty closed, and something had to be said. Something had to be done. The response was careful, narrow, limited to what was unavoidable. It didn't expand the conversation or redefine the situation. It simply acknowledged reality. And that alone marked a shift. Because until that moment, restraint had controlled the pace. Now the pace was pushing back. What mattered wasn't the content of the move. It was the fact that it happened at all. Once a side that had been waiting is forced to act, the margin disappears. Language tightens, options shrink, every word is weighed for what it might invite next. People watching understood this immediately. Advisors stopped assuming flexibility that had existed weeks earlier. Timelines that had been treated as adjustable were suddenly fixed. Markets adjusted expectations again, this time not around outcomes, but around how quickly the next move might be forced. Reactions followed without delay. Partners watching the exchange recalculated exposure. Conversations that once explored possibilities now focused on limits. The room for interpretation narrowed, and with it, the sense of control. What made this moment especially revealing was how Canada responded to the forced move. There was no rush to capitalize on it, no visible effort to accelerate the process. The posture remained steady, almost unchanged, and that steadiness under someone else's pressure carried weight. The dynamic shifted again. Waiting had produced a move. The move clarified where patience ended. And now both sides were operating with fewer options than before. Which brings the tension forward. If pressure can now force action, but that action doesn't produce resolution, what happens next when the cost of waiting rises again? Because once the first forced move has been made, every move that follows becomes harder to frame as choice and easier to read as necessity. The second move didn't feel like a decision. It felt like an adjustment made under watch. After the first forced action, nothing reset. There was no release of pressure, no sense that the moment had passed. Instead, the environment tightened again, and this time it happened faster. What had been treated as an exception no longer felt isolated. One move made the next easier to anticipate and harder to avoid. The next response arrived sooner than expected, not rushed, but no longer comfortably delayed. The space between actions shortened. That change showed up immediately. Conversation skipped over hypotheticals. Preparation replaced exploration. Planning meetings stopped circling possibilities and began bracing for outcomes that hadn't been openly discussed yet. Time compression followed. Gaps that once allowed room to maneuver closed. Each move now carried the weight of the last. The margin for improvisation narrowed, and with it, the sense that patience could always buy more space. Markets reflected this quietly. Volatility didn't spike, but expectations tightened. Analysts stopped modeling wide ranges and began clustering around fewer paths. When uncertainty narrows instead of expanding, it usually means options are being removed, not added. Across the exchange, behavior adjusted again. Language grew more careful. Commitments became smaller. Each acknowledgement left less room to step back. What had once felt reversible now carried residue, and with each move, returning to an earlier, more flexible state felt less plausible. That's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Forced moves were no longer isolated moments. They were beginning to stack. What stood out through this compression was how consistently Canada held its posture. No acceleration, no attempt to capitalize, just steady positioning as the pace increased elsewhere. That contrast deepened the asymmetry. One side was reacting to pressure, the other was allowing pressure to do the work. As the sequence continued, acceptance set in quietly. Not stated, not announced, just reflected in how decisions were framed and how options were discussed. The idea that everything could return to the way it had been before began to fade. And with that fading came something harder to dismiss. If forced moves are now part of the pattern, then the situation isn't waiting to be resolved. It's moving towards something that will eventually have to be confronted, which brings the tension forward again. If the path is narrowing and adjustments are no longer temporary, what happens when the next move can't be framed as technical? Because once that line is crossed, the next step stops being procedural. It becomes directional. The moment direction began to show itself, it didn't arrive as a declaration, it arrived as a limit. Up to now, every move could still be framed as temporary, an adjustment, a response to circumstance, something that could, in theory, be reversed. But this time, the adjustment ran into a boundary it couldn't pass without consequence. And once that boundary appeared, the story changed shape. The signal was subtle but unmistakable. Language that had allowed flexibility was no longer used. Options that had remained technically available stopped being mentioned altogether, not ruled out, simply left out. And when possibilities stopped being spoken, they stopped being planned for. At that point, it stopped being possible to pretend everything was still open. Meetings began ending sooner. Fewer scenarios were discussed. The conversation narrowed toward a smaller set of outcomes, even if no one said so directly. What people prepared for started to matter more than what they still acknowledged in theory. Reactions followed quickly. Advisors treated certain paths as closed, not because they were impossible, but because reopening them would require explaining too much. Markets reflected this shift with restraint rather than volatility. Pricing in continuity, not resolution. Expecting extension, not reversal. What made this moment different from earlier compression was that behavior now assumed persistence. The idea that pressure would ease on its own no longer guided decisions. People acted as if the current posture would hold and organized around that assumption. Canada's position became clearer in contrast. There was still no acceleration, no attempt to force an outcome, but there was also no preparation for retreat. The posture wasn't just steady anymore, it was consistent across time. And consistency, once established, becomes its own signal. By this point, denial required effort. Treating this as a temporary phase meant ignoring how much behavior had already adjusted, how many options had already been set aside, how much of the environment had reorganized around the expectation that waiting would continue. And that's when the stakes quietly rose again. Because once a direction becomes visible, even without being spoken, changing it stops being neutral. Reversals demand explanation. They invite scrutiny. They carry reputational weight, which brings the tension forward. If direction is now visible but still unacknowledged, what happens when the moment arrives that forces it into the open? Because when choices narrow this far, the next move doesn't just respond to pressure, it defines the path that follows. By the time the next moment arrived, the situation no longer allowed for quiet interpretation. What had been inferred, adjusted to, and planned around now pressed up against the need for acknowledgement. Not a declaration, not a breakthrough, but a recognition that the path everyone had been preparing for was no longer hypothetical. The trigger wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. A routine step that normally wouldn't carry weight suddenly did. Because this time, how it was handled would confirm what many had already assumed, but no one had said aloud. The room understood that before a word was spoken. The response reflected that understanding. Language was chosen carefully, but it was no longer elastic. There was less room to maneuver inside the phrasing, fewer places to hide ambiguity. What wasn't included mattered as much as what was. Silence at this stage stopped being neutral. It began to read as position. Reactions came quickly, not panicked, not volatile, but decisive in their own restrained way. Advisors stopped preparing for reversal. Markets stopped pricing for surprise. Partners adjusted plans as if continuity, not change, was now the safer assumption. The ecosystem aligned around the direction that had been forming quietly for weeks. This alignment carried its own weight. Once enough actors behave as if a path is set, changing it becomes costly regardless of intent. Even a justified shift starts to look disruptive. And disruption invites questions no one is eager to answer. What stood out most was how little effort Canada needed to expend at this stage. The posture held without reinforcement, no additional signaling, no tightening. The environment itself carried the momentum forward. When others adjust around your position, you don't need to restate it. By now, the earlier appeal felt distant, not irrelevant, but absorbed into something larger. What began as a request for relief had become a reference point, not a driver. The structure of the interaction had changed, and with it, the meaning of each subsequent move. This is the point where outcomes start to feel baked in, even before they arrive. Not finalized, but shaped enough that alternatives no longer feel equally real. The space for surprise narrows, not because options vanish overnight, but because choosing them would now require explaining why so much preparation was misplaced. Which brings the tension to its edge. If direction is now shaping behavior across the system, and acknowledgement is quietly underway, what happens when the final step can no longer be deferred? Because the next move won't just confirm where things are headed, it will make it official. When the final step arrived, it didn't feel like a decision being made. It felt like something being acknowledged. By this point, the direction had already shaped behavior for weeks. Plans had adjusted, assumptions had shifted, language had narrowed. The system had been moving as if the outcome was known, even while no one had formally said it. The last move didn't create that reality, it confirmed it. That's why the moment landed quietly. There was no sense of surprise in the room, no scramble to interpret meaning. Most of the work had already been done before the words were spoken. What remained was alignment, not negotiation. This is how leverage often resolves in the real world, not with a dramatic reversal and not with a clear winner declared, but with one side realizing that time, patience, and positioning had already done what pressure could not. The appeal that started this chain wasn't ignored, it was absorbed, and once absorbed, it stopped driving the interaction. What mattered most was what never had to happen. There was no rush to reassure, no urgency to explain, no need to reassert authority. The posture held because it no longer needed reinforcement. Others had already adjusted around it. Looking back, the shift didn't begin with the response that went viral. That response simply revealed something that had been forming underneath, a balance where urgency lived on one side and time lived on the other. And when those two forces meet, leverage rarely behaves the way people expect. This wasn't about trade relief in the end. It was about who could afford to wait without erosion and who couldn't. It was about which side needed movement and which side could let movement come to it. Once that difference became clear, the rest followed naturally. That's the part most people miss when they focus only on headlines. Power doesn't always show up as action. Sometimes it shows up as stillness that others have to move around. And once that happens, the outcome stops being negotiated in public. It gets settled quietly through behavior, timing, and the limits everyone eventually accepts. If this video was educational or helpful, and if it changed how you see power and leverage in moments like this, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you in the next video. Take care.